I'd like to welcome you back to the show. One of the least understood things in our society is the constitutional right to post bail, which is under assault nationwide, here, including here in California, because some people think it's kind of a form of economic racism and bigotry. Jeff Clayton is with us, Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on again, Andy.
It's our pleasure. Tell us, my mind's a blur. What is the status on bail in California?
So, as you recall, Senate Bill 10 passed, and I think since last we spoke, the bail industry, along with some others, bail agents, et cetera, launched a referendum drive. We got the signatures, within the 90-day time period, and now Senate Bill 10 by Senator Hertzberg and Assemblyman Bonta will be on the November 2020 ballot.
And so bail continues as it was because it's the referendum to repeal is on the ballot.
That's right. It freezes the law for the intervening 2 years until 2021 at some point.
All right. And the arguments that Hertzberg and others used to pass this law is the same as being used in other parts of the country?
I think so. Just that some people can afford their bail, some people can't, and we shouldn't have bail schedules because that's unfair to poor people, whereas rich people could get out.
Okay, and what effect does it – tell us about the recent U.S. Supreme Court affirmation on the constitutionality of money bail and bail schedules. The fact that it's constitutional, does that mean have a bearing on whether or not California can end it?
Well, a couple of things. I think it takes out their argument. So obviously, Eric Holder picked this fight out of a case that started in a Walmart parking lot in Alabama, Varden versus City of Clanton, which continued on throughout that time period in 2015, 2016. The City of Calhoun, Georgia, finally decided that they were going to not allow these challenges to continue. This was over a public intox ticket, $160 bail. In this case, they didn't allow a review. Then they did allow a review within 48 hours. The 11th Circuit affirmed that you could have a bail schedule as long as it's reviewed within 48 hours, which is the law in California. And so the plaintiff's lawyers challenged it, and just on Monday, the U.S. Supreme Court denied cert, meaning that you can have bail, you can have a bail schedule, you just need to have a review of that by a judge within 48 hours. So what does that mean in California, just to kind of say that, is that the judge in San Francisco, since last we spoke, has ruled that the bail schedule in San Francisco is unconstitutional because it discriminates based on wealth. And she applied the strict scrutiny standard, whereas the Supreme Court allowed the rational basis standard to apply. So we don't know what's going to happen at this point.
Well, the fact that and here, this is my threshold question here. The fact that the United States Supreme Court upheld that it is constitutional doesn't necessarily imply that states have to have bail, i.e. that it's unconstitutional not to have bail?
Right. Well, there's some question to that. But, yeah, you could go to this kind of federal model of detention and release with limited bail in the middle. It's a constitutional system, but not in California, because in the right to bail states where the state constitution says all persons shall be bailable by sufficient sureties, you cannot deny the right to bail. And that's the fallacy of Senate Bill 10, is that they want to deny Californians' right to bail in favor of the state deciding who gets in and who gets out, rather than judges setting bail like they've always done on this continent for 400 years.
Now, could you tell us about some of the experiments that they're doing instead of bail?
Yes, I think New Mexico is probably an interesting one, because they've implemented a system where prosecutors have to have a bail mini trial to decide who gets detention and who gets released, within 2 days, and they're just not able to keep up the load. And so, you had the terrorist training camp where they abducted kids and they were training them to do school shootings, got released on their own recognizance because the prosecutor couldn't put the evidence together. New Jersey is really the other big one where there's been a lot of experiments there, and really what we're finding out is, the government could do the job that the bail industry does, but in the case of New Jersey, they've spent $250 million for really results that really aren't much better. In fact, even worse than the current system, because more people are committing crimes and more people are failing to show up for court.
Now, there's this other thing I have, this piece a reference to it by Adam Liptak from the New York Times that question whether or not poor people, especially blacks in these inner city hellholes, were getting exploited or helped by the presence or the phenomena of bail.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. You know, there's I think, you know, who's in jail and why is not a clear picture. You know, one journalist went into Rikers Island in New York because it was, you know, complaining that it's a bunch of turnstile jumpers and, you know, low-level possessors of marijuana, which turned out to be two turnstile jumpers and one low-level possessor of marijuana. Other research that we've seen has shown that, you know, over a 5-year period in New York, everybody who got arrested had an average of, you know, 3.8 prior felony convictions and, you know, 4 prior misdemeanors and 4 prior failures to appear. So, does bail exploit the population? I mean, I think there's overrepresentation in the system, so that based on those numbers, those are going to be users of the system, but that's not bail's fault. We help them get out of jail, and they should have the same rights as everybody else. And just hopefully we can reduce, you know, overrepresentation in the future, but that's not something we're going to solve by fixing the bail system.
Now, one of the things that is a controversy here in our county is there's, you know, we're getting a new jail built, and some people are arguing, well, you know, if you didn't hold all these people in jail before they were even convicted, i.e. the jail isn't for as much for people who are serving time after their court conviction, but it was people waiting to go to trial. What are your thoughts on the number of people being held pre-trial?
Yeah, I think, you know, it should be 100%, as you said, and that would be the old days. That's the way it worked. That, you know, very few people would be serving a sentence. That jail is a temporary place to be. And not in California anymore, of course, as we know, because a lot of the people that were in prison are now in jails, and we're using jail more as prison. To the idea that we shouldn't build jails, I mean, a lot of the jails are outdated. They're old. They're not comfortable for the staff or for the inmates. They have all kinds of other problems, and, you know, they could be a lot better and, you know, more humane, and I think for that reason they should be built.
Well, let me be clear here. Do you think that some sheriffs are abusing the pretrial and/or the courts are failing to not release enough people pre-trial and should reserve jail space for people who are convicted?
Well, not in California. I mean, the profile that California, the people involved in the system that are in jail are much more dangerous, much more risky than in other states. And in some other states, yeah, there is a need for that. You know, you've got municipal courts holding people on $200 traffic warrants in a lot of places in this country, and so it does need to be worked on. In California, you know, probably speed up the process so that, you know, people can get moved to where they need to go and get the cases solved a lot more quickly.
Now, the other factor is there's an issue of bail is discouraging flight, but there's also an issue of bail bondsmen / bounty hunters recapturing the defendants. Could you talk about those two aspects?
Yeah, I think in California, because the bonds are so high that the agents have a lot to lose, that it is a powerful incentive. When you're going to lose $250,000, that's a lot of incentive to chase people around the world, not only just around the United States. And so that's another safety net that I think is important to ensure that, you know, we are the long arms of the law, as one professor said, that we prove our worth when somebody fails to appear, and we have the incentive to bring them back. All of that will be gone in the new system in California. And we'll be hoping that people will just, after they abscond, just change their mind, but we know that they probably won't. And if they stay in California, they'll probably commit another crime, and at that point we'll get them. Otherwise, they'll go on to some other jurisdiction and, begin victimizing people there.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Our guest, Jeffrey Clayton, Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. You're listening to The Andy Caldwell Show. Stay tuned.
The Andy Caldwell Show is sponsored in part by CoLab, the Coalition of Labor, Agriculture, and Business.
You are listening to The Andy Caldwell Show, the only talk show that covers the entire Central Coast, our state, and nation.
I'd like to welcome you back to the show. There's a lot of controversy across the land about bail, even though most people believe that there's a constitutional right to bail. There's others that think they know something better than the rest of us. Jeffrey Clayton is our guest, Executive Director of the American Bail Coalition. And as we just explained why bail it matters and why it works and why we need it, I have a piece here from the American Bail Coalition talking about the fourth generation of bail reform. Can you talk a little bit about the history and what is the fourth generation's principles?
Yeah, so, we've been in kind of three generations of bail reform in this century, at least according to most experts. The third generation kind of really started around 2008, 2010, which was really to go back to the second generation, which is to use bail for all kinds of things that it's not supposed to do, which is to solve crime, to do all kinds of different things, to collect money off of people. And we've sort of perverted the original purpose of bail, which is securing your release, and having a third party come in and basically take custody of you in a legal sense. The other thing is that we're supervising people. We're using all these tentacles of the state that we're putting in people, like ankle monitors and all this sort of thing. So we've been accused of not having sort of a plan of what bail reform would be, and that's where the fourth generation of bail reform came from brainstorming different ideas of how to fix the system. Not that, not all of them apply in every state, but the main principles are to stop using bail as a collections mechanism, to oppose the use of bail algorithms and big data to assign conditions of bail, and to really return it to what it was originally supposed to be. And so, depending on the jurisdiction it applies. And for example, in California, our recommendation of getting rid of nuisance bails of, a couple $100, well, that doesn't really happen in California, so they've already made that one. But in many states, it does apply. So it's our hope that we can make the bail system better and return it to what it's supposed to be, rather than going down the road of continuing to go to preventative detention and algorithms and supervision, which has proven not to work over the last generation.
Could you expand more on how these bail algorithms work, what they're supposed to do, but what really goes on with them?
Yeah, well, the reality is most of them aren't transparent, so we don't know. But what we know in general is that they take a big amount of data, they find factors that correlate with crime, and then they try to assign weights to those, and then they literally just create a scoring system. And that is given to judges with a recommendation on what they think the bail and the conditions of release should be.
And one of the things, before I get to the next question, you mentioned preventative detentions. What's that mean?
That means a legal process to deny bail altogether. And that's kind of the foundation of Senate Bill 10. So under the current system, the judge says, well, your bail is $100,000. If you don't post it, you stay in. If you do post it, you get out. Under the new system, the government decides who they want to lock up, and then they go prove that you're a danger or a flight risk, and then they get to deny bail. So you can imagine over history and over time, it's been abused, and primarily against political opponents. So in California, you can imagine that any potential firearm offense that, the government officials will detain, even though there'll be a whole swath in those charges, whichever ones we pick, and so it'll probably be used in a political fashion.
And, the issue, and we should highlight this, if I remember correctly, when these guys do these reform measures, that means you either don't get bail at all or no bail is required. There's nothing in between. And so there could be people have to go to jail who could have raised bail, and then there's other people who are a flight risk that should have posted bail that don't have to do nothing. So it seems like it's the worst and most extreme of all the options.
It is, and then, the other thing that we're going to add in California under Senate Bill 10 is for the judges, when they get to watch people get out that shouldn't get out, their option is just to hammer them with all this electronic technology, which one commentator calls e-carceration, and the defendants don't have to pay for it under Senate Bill 10. So you can bet every judge in California will have every defendant, going to get drug screening, being on a GPS monitor, being on house arrest, all this sort of thing, which isn't going to work and is probably more restrictive and is completely unnecessary. But at least the drug monitoring companies and the ankle monitor companies, along with a massive, unionized workforce that's going to have to run all this, we'll be happy about it.
So So tell me about the ankle monitoring. The bottom line is somebody is told, okay, you're going to wear this monitor, so we'll know where you're at. You're only allowed to go to work and church or maybe pick your kid up from school. So we're not paying to house them. We're not paying to feed them, but at least on principle or theory, we're allowed to constrain their movement. What is your thoughts on that versus jail or bail?
Well, I think it's unnecessary and it's proven not to work except in a limited number of cases. The reality is you have to respond to it. And once the suspects or defendants understand that you're not going to, it's meaningless. And that's why it can't be used as a general policy, because if we're going to go police every bail violation, we've got a major problem. Like my home state of Colorado, for example, people on supervision, the number one crime that they're charged with is violating, in a majority of the cases, the new crime is violating their conditions of release. So the question is, can we really realistically police all these conditions and respond to them? I don't think we can. And then that's not to say we shouldn't have any electronic monitors, but they should be reserved for the highest risk cases.
And the other thing that bugs the heck out of me, of course, is the fact that, and we mentioned this earlier, the state released a bunch of felons out of prison, because that's pretty much the only people that were going to prison as felons, because they couldn't afford to pay the guards and take care of the prisoners at the same time. So the prisoners had to go. And so they went back into the jails, and then the jails had to kick people out who were serving time there because there was no room left in the jail. And now they're just out there roaming the streets. And then to make things worse, they lowered a bunch of felonies to misdemeanors, and then they lowered misdemeanors to infractions. So now people don't even get booked. They get cited, and we have a bunch of failures to appear where people think, hey, I got a ticket. I'm not going to show up because the penalty is another ticket. What are they going to do to me?
Yeah, I think, as I travel other states, they look at California and think that California needs criminal justice reform, and they find it to be hilarious. And the main thing, as I hear, is they've already let everybody out. Like, who's left other than serious, multiple-time offenders? And that's what we have. That's the reality in California, who's in jail. I mean, these progressive policies have gone on for so long. And then at a certain point, it's going to cause damage, and I think it already is causing damage, to the sort of the fabric of California, that it's a safe place and we actually care about victims' rights and all these sort of things.
Now, we see these stats. Are these stats doctored when they say, serious crimes going down? Is that just because they degraded the classifications?
Well, that certainly has something to do with it, and then there's this other little concept in having, represented police officers. When you demoralize the police force, there's less self-initiated policing, meaning that they're just following calls and they're not sticking their neck out to prosecute crimes that they know they're never going to get a conviction. DAs are going to dismiss them. And so that can have the effect of, in a city where crimes could be increasing, calls for service could be increasing, convictions could be going down. And so it's really hard to, sometimes figure out what's going on. Usually the public, people on the street know what's going on. And you can talk to anybody in San Francisco or L.A. and know that, petty thefts and street crimes are going up.
And why are not more DAs and or law enforcement people speaking up about this aspect? Because I agree with you. I've talked to cops, and they said, "Why we're not going to bother writing this person up because nothing's going to happen."
I don't know. I mean, I think we need to maintain justice. I think, everybody's concerned of the overrepresentation of minority defendants, which is a real problem. I think it's more socioeconomic, and there's all kinds of other problems that cause sort of the breakdown of certain communities. But I think that's probably why, people don't come out, in force saying the current system is completely just, because in a certain way it's not. But at the same time, it's case by case, and you got to think that we're doing the best job that we can.
And what about the homeless, in terms of their failures to appear, they're committing? Because one of the things California did is it raised the stakes on how much you could steal at a time. And were those people going to jail before, and were they in there? And what happened to them when they couldn't post bail?
They probably weren't going. Certainly few of them will be going now. On a reality basis, these are the problem children. These are the ones that never show up. that don't care, and for good reason. They're homeless and they just don't care. And so those are the people that aren't going to show up. And the question is, what do we do? What do we do about that? And in California, I would say we probably don't do much, if anything, about that. And that's why, California has a tenth of the country's population and a third of the country's homeless.
Well, I'll tell you, it's insane. Little town here on the Central Coast, Lompoc, California. There were people living in a riverbed for some of them upwards of 15 years. And they violated all sorts of laws and rules and conditions, and it actually endangered the community for flooding by cutting into the riverbed, building homes inside the riverbed. And I've not heard of a single one being prosecuted.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've got to maintain social order, and I believe this country has enough wealth to make sure that, we can give people the opportunity they need, and if they don't, want to cash in those opportunities, we still have to hold them accountable, because the rest of us want to have a nice community and a nice place to live, and, we can't let these people mess it up.
All right. Hey, thank you so much for your great work and for being back on the show.
You got it, Andy. Have a good weekend.
All right.